Okay, now it's Kani.
Yeah,
Silakan Kani, thank you.
yeah, sure, Buneta. Okay. Good evening and good morning to all participants. Welcome again to the second day of public seminar, Academic Writing for International Publication. My name is Pinkani, and I would like to thank you again for joining us on the second day of the workshop. For today, the first session will be led by Paul Nerney with the theme of review and revision strategies, research paper introductions. Subsequently, the second session will discuss the current trends in academic publishing to be led by Dr. Paul Gratoska. First of all, allow me to briefly again introduce the facilitators of this workshop. The first one, Paul Nerney. Mr. Nerney designed, taught, and coordinated courses in English as a second language and English as a first school language for the Center of English Language. And more recently, he has conducted writing workshops for graduate degree candidates and junior faculty in Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and also Indonesia. He is also a mentor for the U.S. Social Science Research Council's Global Scholars Initiative. And our second facilitator for today is Dr. Paul H. Gratoska. Dr. Gratoska is publishing director and formerly director of NUS Press at the National University of Singapore. He served on the board of directors of the U.S. Association for Asian Studies from 2003 until 2005 and is past editor of the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies and current editor of the Journal of the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. Before I give the floor to the facilitators, allow me to remind all participants to please use the Q&A function to write your questions. Please mention your name and also your institutional affiliation. And please do not ask your questions by using the raise hand function, as the participant speakers are currently being turned off on purpose for during the webinar. Sekali lagi, mohon mempergunakan fungsi Q&A untuk menulis pertanyaan Anda, cantumkan nama dan juga nama institusi Anda. Karena semua speaker partisipan di mute untuk kepentingan selama webinar, maka kami tidak bisa menerima pertanyaan Anda jika Anda menyampaikannya dengan menggunakan fungsi raise hand. And now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Paul Nerney to begin his presentation. Please,
okay,
Dr. Paul Nerney.
Thank you very much, Connie. And good evening to everybody. And if there are other people listening elsewhere in the world, good morning and good afternoon as well. I'm going to share my screen now, so just give me a moment to get things up and we'll get started. Okay, and let me just put this on full screen. Okay, and I just want to kind of move people out of the way a little bit. Okay, just going to, there we go. Okay, well, let's see. Let me actually go back. Okay, there we go. Well, as Connie was saying, the title of my talk tonight is Review and Revision Strategies, and we're going to be looking specifically at the research paper introductions. I'll be explaining why in just a little while, why it would be the introduction as opposed to other parts, because there is a question there. But for now, first of all, the organization of the lecture. First off, I do have a reminder to people, which I'll be giving you in just a moment. Then, as the lecture begins, I'd like to just very quickly review some takeaways, for me anyway, from the day one lecture topics that we saw last night. Then after that, after we take a look at those takeaways, then I would like to really look at what is exactly involved in revising research papers, and especially the introduction. And I think with regard to the introduction, this brings me to my fourth, to the fourth thing I'd like to talk about, which are three central questions and responses that we need to think about when we're reviewing research paper introductions. And then At the end of that, I'm going to have a rather long section where I'm going to be looking at examples for exactly what needs to be revised in research paper introductions. We'll be looking at that. In between here, there will be a break at the end of the 4th section, and there will be a Q&A session when we finally finish the 5th section, okay? So that's what's going to be happening tonight. So first of all, the reminders. This has to do with the individual conferences that those of you who have been selected to have your papers reviewed will be going through. So first off, please make sure that you're reviewing your answers to the questions that have been sent to you about your manuscript before you meet with your writing mentor. Okay. The second thing to do, which I think would be a good idea, would be to review the slides on the day 1 lecture topics. In other words, that is what journal editors look for, writing for research publication, and getting published, okay? So that would be the second thing. Also, of course, tonight, pay particular attention to my lecture, Review and Revision Strategies, Research Paper Introduction, because I'll be looking at very specific things that you can do to revise your introductions. Okay. Okay then. Well, let's take a look then at the takeaways from last night's lectures. Okay. And what we saw was, first of all, I think one point that was really made quite clear is that research journal editors want papers, and what do these papers do? They advance new knowledge about topics of concern to various research communities. And the second thing they do is they argue, why is it reasonable to see this new knowledge as both important and innovative? So that's the first thing that we have to kind of focus on. I'd like to take that and bring that into bring that indirectly into things that I have to say tonight. And a lot of what I'm saying is being driven by this. The second thing is, the second takeaway is, when we focus off the journal editors and we start to look at research journal reviewers, what is it exactly that they're doing? Well, first of all, they're there to advise editors about whether a paper is worth publishing or not. And what they do, most crucially, is they provide comments to authors on what needs to be improved to make a paper publishable. So that's what they're doing. And the third thing is, of course, research writers need to be able to effectively respond to editors and reviewers' comments. Now, Professor Gratoska made a very, very he made a very, very pointed comment when he was saying that oftentimes what really actually will happen is you may get a desk rejection. So that's the end right there. And that's what you want to avoid. You want to avoid desk rejections. What you really want is to make sure that the journal editor is interested enough in your paper to send it out for review. Because why? Because, as I'm saying on the slide here, journal reviewers provide comments to authors about what needs to be improved. So even if your paper gets rejected in the end, what you have is you have a set of usually very, very good comments that will help you to make that paper much, much better, much stronger, and something. And basically, they've given you a whole lot of help for being able to send your paper off to another journal in a much, much better condition. So that, to me, was really the takeaways that we got from last night. And I'd like to add on to this tonight by saying, well, what exactly can you do once you've looked at comments and you want to start to revise your paper? What is it that you should be focusing on, especially with regard to the introduction? And what we'll be doing then tonight is we'll be looking at your research topic. We'll be looking at a research gap plus a research question. We'll be looking at research answer and organizational forecast in the introduction. That leads us to a question. What exactly does revising a research paper involve in the first place? And if you take a look at this, the way I've mapped this out for you, you'll see that we have early planning and drafting strategies. And these have to be basically revised. We have later planning and drafting strategies. They need to be revised. And finally, when we get to revision, well, exactly what are we doing? Well, you'll see two things here that I have in yellow, and this is what I'll be focusing on tonight. It's not because the other things aren't important, because they are important, but we've only got 2 hours here. So, I mean, I've decided that this is what, this is where I'll be focusing on things. And the reason why I'm focusing on the revision and redrafting of the wording and organization of ideas is this. There's a lot that has really been said about identifying core information. In other words, what makes a journal article read like a journal article and not not, for example, a research proposal or a research report. And there's a lot said about that. And I don't really, frankly, have very much more to add to that. I mean, it's really been done quite well. Likewise, the visualization and organization of core information into a text, there's a lot of good stuff that's available online, that's available in print, and really lays it right out for you how to visualize core information, how to organize that visually speaking. So I really have very little to add to that. And likewise, when we look at revision and redrafting strategies, when we talk about revising and redrafting visualization and organization of ideas, I actually don't have much more to say about that because, again, there's so much good stuff out there. And of course, the thing that really is often stressed about revising format, punctuation, and spelling. Well, there's got to be a gazillion pieces of information out there that tell you how to do that. And once again, I don't have much to add to that. But what I do have to add is this, that for the most part, when we talk about wording and organizing core information, surprisingly, there's very, very little about that. For example, you start taking a look at how do people talk to each other about revising a paper. They'll say, for example, well, you got a really, really, really strong argument here. I like what you really did here. This is really, really, this really gets us right to the center of things. Now, notice that there's metaphor, this strong argument to the center of things, or maybe the opposite. The argument is weak. It's not convincing. It just seems to be running around in circles. I don't quite get what you're trying to say here. So we see people struggling when they're commenting on other people's work. When they're looking at their own work, we tend to think in metaphors. And why would that be? Well, I think the research shows that what happens is that as we learn early planning and drafting strategies, as we learn later planning and drafting strategies, and as we learn strategies for revision and redrafting, what happens is that we internalize these things. In other words, these are things that we can do, but we have a very, very difficult time talking about them. Same thing for riding a bicycle. You can ride a bicycle, right? But it's very hard to talk about how you actually ride a bicycle. It's very difficult to describe that. And so we begin to resort to metaphors, but oftentimes the metaphors really hide what's going on. So tonight, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce you to a meta language, a language that does not use metaphors to talk about the wording and organization of core information in a research article. And how do you revise that? What do you do to revise that? Okay. So a good place to look here would be the basic revision process for research papers. And what we see here is that it involves review. And so, of course, when we're talking about the revision process, and I like to start here because I think it's a good place to start. We've all had this experience. It's something we're familiar with. So you review each section of your paper. And why are you doing that? Well, you want to determine whether it has content, language, and organizational features that are needed to carry out the section's expected rhetorical functions. And we'll be talking about expected rhetorical functions in just a little while, so bear with me on that, okay? So we're reviewing those things. We're also, based on that review, we're trying to decide which content, which language, and which organizational features need to be revised. So when we're talking about revising things, we're talking about three things really, okay? The first thing is you may make a decision to delete certain content or certain language or certain organizational features because they're not related to your purpose, or they may be related, but they're not particularly relevant to the purpose. So you just need to get rid of them. So that can be a decision that you make. Or maybe you want to keep the content or the language or the organizational feature, but it needs to be changed. It needs to be modified for greater clarity, conciseness, coherence, and so forth. Or it may be that you've got content or you've got language or you've got organizational features, and it's not really making things clear. It's not making things concise. It's not making things coherent. Something else needs to be added to be able to articulate new insights. So that's the third thing, that whole decision process that goes on. Then finally, based on your decisions, that's when you sit down and you actually redraft each section of your paper. Now, pretty much as I was just saying, that there's a lot of things that go on. And when I was looking at your papers, one thing that struck me was this. I think actually the strategies you're using for deciding content, organizational language, organizational features, you're actually doing this. I can see evidence or indirect evidence, at least, of deletion, modification, addition. Also, the fact that you've produced a paper and I was able to read that paper means that you were drafting, and I suspect redrafting sections of the paper. So I'm not worried about that. For example, like redrafting, you don't have writer's block. Otherwise you wouldn't have produced the paper. Likewise, there is evidence in the paper that things have changed over time as well. So I know you're making decisions. So it's really the review process that I really, really, really want to focus on, because this is the thing that nobody talks about for reasons I was just mentioning when we were looking at that mapping of the research of the writing process. Okay, so I want to focus on review tonight. I'm not worried about your decision making. You make decisions, and your ability to get on the computer and change things if you have to. So that leads to three central questions and responses for reviewing research paper introductions. I think at this point we need to sort of talk about why introductions. Why would we start there? Well, it's the obvious thing that the introduction is the beginning of the paper, so you start at the beginning of the paper. But that's actually not a very good reason. In fact, when we look at the research on things, actually we find when people are asked, what is the most difficult thing for you to write? Actually, people will say it's the midsection arguments. It's the arguments that basically explain that explain certain concepts in the research answer that must be explicated before before the answer can even make sense. So, and also, if you happen to have more than one answer within your research community, why is your answer preferable to other possible answers? So, in other words, justifying that. So, argumentation has those two functions, and that's what people find very, very difficult. But I think, judging from your papers that I saw, where we should really start is with the introductions, and I'll explain that. I'll explain that now. So when we look at introductions, that a question that we have to ask: does my introduction have the core information that will make it read like the introduction to a research paper? In other words, does it have a research topic? Does it have a research gap? Does it have a research answer? And does it have an organizational forecast? And as you can see from the kinds of core information that we have here, we actually have the whole paper in its making. The introduction is introducing what the paper is going to be about. It starts with a topic. It then creates a gap. It then fills that gap by answering the research question. And finally, we have the organizational forecast, which basically will outline the claims that have to be argued for the research answer to make sense. So if we can actually answer this question, if you can actually answer the question, say, this is my topic, this is my gap, plus my research question, this is my answer, and here's what I'm going to argue, then you have actually laid out the whole paper. And it really puts you in a much, much stronger place to really be able to reorganize and to reselect information that will make your arguments strong. Yes, okay, strong. We're not going to talk. We're not going to use that. I'm not going to use those metaphors, but I couldn't help myself. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. There's when we start to take a look at core information, then each piece of core information, each type of core information is structured in a very, very particular way. And I'd like to show you how each piece of core information, each type of core information is structured. So with the research topic, there's always going to be a topic phrase, and there's a sentence into which it's embedded. And just hang on to that idea for a little while. There's also a research gap. It has a bridge. In other words, a shift from the topic to the gap. There's what I'm going to call a knowledge-based problem, and then there's a research question. So the gap has three structural elements that need to be present for the gap to be read as a research gap in a research paper. If any of these are missing, maybe with the exception of the bridge, the paper's in trouble. Research answer. Once again, there's a bridge from the gap to the answer, and then we have a summary of your main research results. Finally, we have the organizational forecast, and this is, once again, there's a bridge from the answer, well, here's what needs to be argued generally, to here's the specific points we're going to be arguing here. And once again, the organizational forecast will be a summary of main points to be argued in midsections. And also, there may be, aside from midsection arguments, there may be other sections, for example, like methodology. You may choose to actually, before you begin to argue the answer, you may simply want to present your findings. There are different ways to organize the paper. So we have the organizational forecast doing that as well. Now, there's a third question you need to ask here. Does your introduction integrate its core information with a review of previous studies to carry out 4 rhetorical tasks that make the introduction read like a research paper introduction? And I'd like to show this to you. So we have these tasks, and the first task is, this is what the paper has to do. That, in other words, the research paper is really a paper with very, very important ideas. In other words, it's answering a question. The introduction is answering a question. What does your research community currently know about the topic, and why does it matter to your research community? So that's the first rhetorical task. When I talk about rhetorical task, I'm talking about how you're engaging with your readers. Your readers are asking questions, you're answering the questions. So your readers will bring this question to your paper. Does your paper have important ideas or not? In other words, the question there, okay? The second one is that you want to show in the introduction that your research paper has significant ideas. And what do we mean by significant? Well, it means what is currently not well understood about the topic, but it should be better understood by your research community. Mm-hmm. So that's when we talk about significant ideas, this is what we mean. If we operationalize things, how we're engaging people, then this is what we're working with here. The third thing is, does the research paper have new ideas? In other words, what's the new understanding of the topic that has emerged from your main research results? And fourthly, do you actually have arguable ideas? In other words, are there points that have to be argued so that this new understanding is comprehensible and ultimately acceptable to your readers or not? So this is what needs to be happening in the introduction. So the introduction is not the longest section of your paper by any means, but rhetorically speaking, it is the most complex. And so you have to be You have to make sure that the core information is being integrated with a review of previous studies to make these 4 tasks happen. So let's take a look at that. So if we look at how core information is integrated into previous studies, well, this is what happens. So here's our introduction, right? Here's our core information. Into this core information, this core information is integrated into a literature review. And when we take the research topic and we integrate it into the literature review, this is where we get our important ideas with that question we just looked at. When we look at the research gap has to do with significant ideas. In other words, what's not well understood. The research answer is offering new ideas. Now you notice I have a broken line here, right? Okay, sometimes you come up with an answer that really nobody else has discussed. It's rare, but it happens. So I've made a broken line. But for the most part, the research answer is probably reflecting things that have been said before. But once again, if you have previous answers that are filling in the research gap, then you have to show how your understanding is different from those previous answers. So once again, when we're integrating things together, that's what's going to happen. And then the organizational forecast usually doesn't involve a literature review, because what it's really doing is it's saying arguable ideas. And so these ideas from the research answer have to be argued, they have to be explained, possibly they have to be justified so that the understanding is comprehensible to readers. So there's no literature review, but you can kind of see the break that we have the literature review in the introduction, and the topic, the gap, and the answer, they are all establishing their importance by looking back at the literature, at the previous literature. The organizational forecast is a bit different. It's actually looking forward to maybe new arguments that have never been seen before. So that's what we're getting there. Okay, so this is how it's done. Okay, now for you, the aspects of your research paper introductions do need revision, and there are certain reasons why this is the case. I did a little analysis of your paper. So I looked at the topic and its integration with and the literature review, and said, did I get something that's clearly stated, something that I can really see the importance of what's going on here? And 59% of the papers I reviewed do this. 41% tried, but it wasn't really, the importance wasn't really clear. I mean, I really couldn't see it. I couldn't read it. In some cases, I might be able to make a guess, but I wasn't sure that my guess was correct. And there were no topics and literature reviews that were unstated. Now, with the gap, when that gets integrated into, integrated into the literature, I felt that for 24% of the papers, I could actually see the significance of what you were saying. I say, wow, yeah, you know, maybe this is not my, in most cases, it's not my research community, but you know, I could see where members of a research community might be really concerned about this gap. There's something they really don't know. The community's in ignorance for all intents and purposes. And so, you know, as soon as I see that, I say, yeah, this paper probably is onto something. It's significant. 76% of those papers, however, once again, the significance, it looks like kind of an interesting topic you got, but I can't really actually see the significance of really what's going on, to be quite honest. You know, that becomes problematic, and I'm sure like a journal editor would find that problematic as well. Once again, there was no paper that wasn't trying to do this. It's just that many of the papers didn't succeed, and we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why would that be the case? In terms of, now, there's an important part of the gap which I want to deal with separately. although it is really part of the gap, is the research question. In terms of clearly stated research question, none of the papers has a really clear question. 41% have what I think might be a clear question. I'm not sure. And definitely, I did not, in 59% of the papers, I did not see a research question. That's quite serious for reasons that we'll see in just a bit. So the significance of the paper, of the papers is suffering. The significance of the papers is something we really need to work on. And you need to think about this, okay? Now, in terms of the research answer and literature review, similarly, we see something else. 11%, I think, really showed that they're onto something new. Something that's going to be a new insight into the topic, something that really probably hasn't been said before. 17% of the papers tried, but once again, it was not clear exactly what is new, honestly. And 72% of the papers didn't even try. I can't see evidence. I can't see evidence of it in the papers. Linguistically speaking, in terms of the discourse structure. For the organizational forecast, nobody clearly stated it. Only one person, 6%, even tried, and the rest of you didn't even bother saying, well, here's what's going to be argued in the rest of the paper. So once again, that's something that we need to look at. In other words, it's not clear what's going to be argued in the paper, and again, that is quite serious. I mean, something that should be looked at. Now, at this point, let's take a. We've been going for just about a half hour now. Let's just take a 5-minute break. I'd like you to use this 5-minute break to sort of cogitate on your papers and see where you are in all of this. I'm going to go back now and just leave this on the screen for you to stare at, and just think about, well, where does your paper fit into each of these five categories that we're looking at as you try to integrate your topic into the previous literature, the research gap into the previous literature, the answer, and so forth. Okay, let's okay, so at 8:10 by my watch.
Okay, so we will have a 5-minute break from now. So we'll be back again at 7:10 p.m.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, it's 8 o'clock where I am. Yes, okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
okay.
Thank you, Connie. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Nani, I think it's already 10 past
Right.
7. So if
Yep.
you would like to start again.
I certainly would. Okay, so what we've seen so far is I've given you a meta language, a way of asking questions, those questions I introduced you to, but then also a way of looking at certain kinds of core information and the way that and looking at the internal structure of these things. So I've given you a way of looking at that. But really, what we need to see now are some examples of how this actually really all works. I mean, what are we kind of looking at here? So the next part of our of the talk here, and this will be the main body of the talk, really, are examples of what needs to be revised in research paper introductions. Okay, so we're going to be looking at some examples of this now. But I will be going over the meta language again to show you how it works. It is really something you can use in talking to yourself about papers, but you can also teach this to other people, and you can actually form a group where you can look at each other's papers and you can critique the papers without saying, well, this is the lousiest paper I've ever seen. I don't know why the earth just doesn't open up and swallow you. This is such a crappy paper. So because sometimes you really do get that in writing groups. You get people with big egos, and they're horrible, they do horrible things. But if you have a meta language that allows you to be to objectively look at a paper, then it's a lot better off. You say, well, you got a strong argument, you got a weak argument. Again, it's confusing to talk to people like that because everybody's shaking their heads. Yeah, what's he talking about? What do you mean strong? Why is my argument? Why is my argument strong? Why is my argument weak? Why is my introduction not clear? What is he talking about? So, I mean, we try to be polite about this, but oftentimes these discussions don't go very far because we don't have very precise ways of talking about the informational, about the linguistic and the organizational features of a paper. So let's take a look and see how that works now. Okay, so let's go back to our questions here. We'll tweak them just a little bit now. Does the statement of the research topic provide two structural elements about your research paper, about your research community's current understanding of the research topic and the topic's importance? And we saw that we need a topic phrase. In other words, it identifies a specific aspect of your research community's understanding of the topic, okay? And then we have a literature review, and that outlines your research community's current understanding of the topic, right? And so I'd like to look at some tasks for reviewing a research topic then. And so one thing you can say is, have you constructed a topic phrase that identifies a specific aspect of your research community's understanding? What would that look like? Here's an example. Topic phrase. So you look for just a phrase. In the example I'm going to use the writer's phrase was this: transformation of the university. The whole paper is built around that one phrase. Okay, I mean it's not the only thing, but this is what starts it off: the transformation of the university. So by itself, it doesn't mean too much. So she has to basically embed this phrase into her introduction's first paragraph, and so she does. She creates a topic sentence, and here's the sentence: in the past few decades, the past few decades has seen the massive transformation of the university, where the ideas of managerialism and corporate culture have come to govern the operation and delivery of higher education. And she cites, of course, two people who have worked in this field. So you can already see the embedding, the embedding of the phrase in the first sentence of the first paragraph of her introduction. And at the same time, she's already starting to integrate the topic with what other people have said, right? So you see that happening. And the very important thing is she does it in the first sentence of the first paragraph. Some of you wait several pages before you actually show your topic, and that's very, very confusing. In other words, there's all this this unfocused literature review going on, but there's no particular reason why it's not connected to anything. So you can see how she's immediately taken this notion, the transformation of the university, and she's immediately connected it to other ideals of managerialism, corporate culture. Now, what she's doing here, and this is very important, what she's doing here is she's not trying to describe what she means by managerialism or corporate culture. She's not trying to describe the operation and delivery of higher education. She's not doing that at all. She's just basically identifying ideas that are connected, that are associated with this notion of transformation of the university. So that's all she's doing. And we're going to see this happening a lot, where there's not a whole lot of description or explanation going on in the introduction. What it is really suggesting there are connections, there are relationships between these different ideas that are going to have to be explicated later in the paper. Have you selected studies for your literature review? And this becomes very important because a lot of the papers I read, they're just throwing various studies in for no particular good reason. But one question you have to ask yourself here, which is very important, is have you selected questions for your literature review of the topic that are current? The latest research in your topic, unless maybe you want to include older classics for some reason or other, but what you really want to focus on is the most current research that has been on the topic. A lot of the older stuff doesn't really have to be in there, and it's just taking up room in your paper, and oftentimes it's just confusing. It's just confusing what you're trying to say about the topic anyway. Okay. Are your selected studies related? In other words, do the studies offer clear descriptions and explanations of key ideas that reflect your research community's current understanding of the research topic? In other words, there's there are a lot of studies out there that you can look at, but there are some studies who provide particularly clear descriptions and particularly clear explanations of key ideas. And those are the ones that you really want to choose. You don't want to choose the ones that are maybe less clear or very, very convoluted descriptions and explanations, because as you try to describe the descriptions and explain the explanations, it just gets more and more messy. So you really want to choose studies that really offer these clear descriptions and explanations of things. And that means you have to do a lot of reading. The stuff doesn't just fall out. You have to do a lot of reading and get something to you that speaks, yeah, that really maybe understands something about my topic. That's oftentimes a good notion of relatedness. Is it relevant? In other words, and I'm using the word relevant here to show, is it able to show that the topic is in fact actually a matter of concern, or maybe it's a matter of interest to your research community? So you have currency, you have relatedness, and you have relevance. And those are the ones that you want to choose. Your selection of literature that's going to review the topic needs to do these three things. And if it doesn't do these three things, I would probably not choose it. Okay, it means that you're going to have a tough time trying to make your readers understand its relationship, its connection to the topic. And a lot of you actually do have a big problem that way. And I don't think, frankly, having worked with a number of Indonesian students, I don't think it's because you didn't understand what you were saying. I don't think it was that. I think you simply chose the wrong studies. And once you choose the right studies, all of a sudden, magically, it's not magic at all, but magically, in a very quick fashion, things fall together, and you have a really nice summary of what is currently understood about the topic within your research community. Okay, does the literature review use a small number of key ideas to briefly outline your research community's current understanding of the topic? So, in other words, if you're using papers where they're really talking about lots and lots of different things, then it could get confusing. What you really want to do is you want to cut this, you want to cut the review down to a small number of key ideas that really get people to the, I'm sorry, I'm about to use another metaphor, but get them to the heart of what your community really thinks, okay? In other words, there are some ideas that describe and explain things much, much better than other ideas. And you need to locate those particular papers, okay? So here's an example. Okay, here's an example of key ideas to briefly outline the topic. And notice once again, our reader does this just in 2 sentences. She's quite good with this. I'll tell you a little bit more about this paper as we go on, but for now. Okay, the past few decades has seen a massive transformation of the university, where the ideas of managerialism and corporate culture have come to govern the operations and deliveries of higher education. Notice what's happening here. These key ideas that come from other people's work, I haven't read. The blue is the reader, so is the writer. The writer, in other words, she's giving over her paper right now to what other people have said. Her voice is not really coming through a whole lot. She's really focusing on what other people have said. And she's saying there's 1, 2, 3, there's basically 4, maybe 5 if you want to count that way, key ideas that we have to understand. Notice that she's not really actually defining these things, although there's now an exception. These changes are largely due to the global spread of neoliberalism, a policy regime that discourages government intervention and upholds market ideals as the best means of running economic and social institutions. So in fact, she actually does give us a very, very short operational definition of neoliberalism. And she suggests that it has spread globally, right? So she's dealing with a lot of things here. And even though we may not really understand, well, what are the ideals of neoliberal managerialism? What are the ideals of corporate culture? What is the, how have they come to influence the operation and delivery of higher education? I mean, there's a whole bunch of questions. There's a whole bunch of questions that will come to the reader's mind. But once again, she's engaging them, she's engaging them in a conversation. She's making them ask questions of her. And of course, she needs to answer those questions later in the paper. So you can see what's happening, but a lot of things happening in 2 sentences. You guys, sometimes you're taking paragraph upon paragraph to try to achieve the same thing, but you have to get people down to the core ideas that your community has used to try to describe your topic. So she's really saying, transformation of the university, this is what I want to look at. And these are the things that somehow are doing the transformation in some manner or way. She doesn't explain it yet. She doesn't have to. All she's doing is she's basically giving us a brief outline of what's going to be involved. Okay, now the other thing you need to look at here, aside from just getting the core ideas in, does the literature review group together research studies that present similar or same or similar ideas? So once again, if we start to take a look at this right here, I won't bother reading the whole thing all over again. We've seen this, but I would like to call attention to this phrase: the emergence of a new. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I should read. I'm sorry. I shouldn't read this. We haven't seen this sentence yet. So continuing, she goes on now, and she says, education scholars describe the impact of such phenomena in various ways. Some are optimistic about the emergence of a new university enterprise. And we notice that we have 2 studies here. In other words, there's 2 major studies that have talked about the emergence of a new university enterprise. And she has that in quotes. She has that word in quotes, meaning that this is something that these guys agree on. Is she going to talk about enterprise yet? No, she's not. She just literally puts it in quotes and basically brackets it and says, let's talk about what this means later on. While others are wary of growing academic capitalism. So there's Honowitz, Hoffman, Slaughter, and Leslie. Okay, so 3 studies. So we basically have 5 studies here, 2 of which are talking about the emergence of a new university enterprise. And we have 3 other studies that talk about 3 other major studies that talk about growing academic capitalism. Amidst such a discussion, the current literature is replete with case studies of change changes within the university, such as dwindling public funds and heightened competition to recruit tuition-paying students. And then once again, she says, see Washburn. Okay, so you can kind of see what she's doing here. In other words, she's grouped the people who have similar or same ideas, especially similar key ideas that are going to be important for her to be able to develop her paper. Now, the other thing you have to look at, does the literature review clearly indicate studies with differing understandings of the key ideas? No, sorry, this is where we now take a look at the same thing that we were looking at. Two words that pop out here. There's a group of scholars who are optimistic about the emergence of the new university enterprise, and they're listed there, while others are wary of growing academic capitalism. So in other words, she's saying, in my research community, there's a split. There's a split between between people who are optimistic about the application of neoliberal principles to higher education, while other people really don't like it. Some people see it as an enterprise. Other people see it as academic capitalism. Okay, and so we see that. And of course, what are they talking about? Well, in both cases, whether they're optimistic or whether they're wary, they're talking about problems like dwindling public funds, universities competing with each other to get tuition paying as opposed to non-tuition paying students. So she's dealing with things like that. Okay, so that's what. I'm sorry. Let me just go back a bit. So that's basically what we're looking at when we're developing the statement of the research topic. You have to clearly identify what the topic is, and then you have to basically embed it into your literature review. And as we can see, the literature review here is quite short, but it's doing several different things. It's really looking at, well, what are the various ideas that we really need to look at to understand the topic. Are there some people who have similar ideas? But who are those people? And do we have different groups? Do we have people with differing understandings of these key ideas? Or do we have groups of people? And so that's what she's doing. And this is, I think, what you're missing in your papers. I do want you to pay attention. I want you to start to pay attention to these three questions about the literature review for the topic, because that's what's missing. I think if you start thinking about, if you use these questions to think about the selection of the studies you want to use. In other words, there's a gazillion studies out there, really, honestly, but you only need to pick the ones that you just need to pick the ones that are particularly good at really showing what the current understanding of your research community is. Okay, so and then you put it together, and as you can see, she's done this in 4 sentences, right? Half a page, and that's what you need to be doing. It looks simple it looks simple, but when you look at what she's really doing here, she's doing a lot of work here to get us to understand what her community's understanding is, indeed. Okay, now we get to the research gap. Now, first thing you need to ask yourself then is, does my literature review of the research gap provide 4 structural elements about what my community does not understand well about the research topic? And why is this understanding significant? So first of all, we have a bridge. This is optional, but I think it is important because it signals a switch from the research topic to the research gap. For those of you who were with us last night, you'll remember that Paul Gratoska was talking about non-linear reading. In other words, when you read online, oftentimes there are hyperlinks to other people's work. You can click on that hyperlink and you can go directly to that work. So people are jumping from the work that they're using to other works and jumping back again. And when they do that, they begin to lose the line of analysis. They begin to lose the line of argument that's being made in the original text that they were reading. And one way that you can help your reader get back into your line of analysis or your line of argument is to provide these bridges at the beginning, for example, at the beginning of the research gap. So it's just signaling a switch to the gap. And we'll see an example of that in just a minute. Okay, once again, we have the literature review. Now, the literature review is going to be doing something a little bit different than what we were talking about with the topic. It summarizes previous studies, if any, to outline, number one, how they have reduced poorly understood aspects of the topic. And the second thing is how they imply that there are still other poorly understood aspects of the topic which are significant. Now, why are they significant? Because they are blocking your research community's attempts to better understand the research topic. So this is what's happening. I noticed that a lot of you tried to use the same research studies to talk about the topic, and then the gap, then the question, then in some cases the answer. And so you keep repeating or you keep making reference to the same set of text. And I don't think you can actually really do that. You're going to find there are some previous studies that are very, very good at explaining what the topic is about, what the current understanding of the topic is, but they're not so good at really explaining the research gap. You may have to find a second set of studies to do this. And there may be some studies that are not very good at really, getting people to really understand the topic itself, but they're great at locating a gap. So you have to pick the studies that do the best, that are doing the best job. And so we can see here the literature review, the studies that you pick, they need to basically, first of all, show how certain aspects of the topic have already been, they were poorly understood to begin with, but now they're no longer poorly understood. Okay, and yet there are still poorly understood aspects of the topic that have not been looked at, because they haven't been looked at, because they haven't been researched a whole lot, they're blocking your research community's understanding, attempts to understand the research topic better, right? Okay, so the next thing we have, because remember we have 4 of these, so the third one is a knowledge-based problem. Now, what the knowledge-based problem does is it identifies an aspect of your research topic that's poorly understood by your research community. I know you guys seem to have a lot of problems with this, and I think it helps if you understand exactly what a knowledge-based problem does. Okay? Okay. First of all, sorry. First of all, first of all, I'm sorry. Sorry with that. Okay, first of all, it does identify, it does identify an aspect of your research topic that's still poorly understood. Now, here's the problem. Oftentimes, that aspect of the research topic is complex. It is really quite complex. You're probably not going to be able to talk about the knowledge-based problem in its entirety in a 5,000 to 10,000 word research paper. It's not really possible. So for that reason, you need to frame a question of analysis. If you remember, H Gratoska was talking about questions that begin with how and why last night. Well, this is what I'm talking about now. The introduction frames a question of analysis that must be answered before further progress can be made to resolve the knowledge-based problem and better understand the topic, okay? And it narrows the knowledge-based problem to one or more aspects that can be handled within a 5,000 to 10,000 word research paper. And for many of you, I think this has been a problem. You imply a knowledge-based problem. You don't really actually say what it is, but you imply it. But it really looks very, very complex and very, very large. We can't see how large it is, but it looks very large and very complex. And you haven't really basically decided to say, well, I can't deal with the whole complexity of this problem because I'm only writing one article. So you basically choose one aspect of the knowledge-based problem itself, okay? And you make sure that I can really actually handle this. I can argue it well in 5 to 10,000 words, okay? Okay, well, let's take a let's take a look at the bridge to the research gap. So once again, looking at those, reviewing those questions now, does your literature research of the gap have a bridge statement that indicates that the literature review is switching from what your community knows about the research topic to something your research community does not understand well about the topic, okay? And here's an example. In the second paragraph to the introduction of the article we've been looking at, the writer says, yet, despite this growing literature, remember she was talking about literature related to the topic, right? Yet, despite this growing literature, existing studies tend to be situated within wealthy nations. Now, something very interesting is happening here. We have existing studies. They tend to be found in wealthy nations. Already, there's a gap here, right? There's a gap. They're in wealthy nations, so where are they not? Probably in less wealthy nations. Who are those less wealthy nations? What are we talking about here? So she's setting once again, she's setting something up for us to make the reader ask questions of her. Okay, now, once again, we look at the literature here. Okay, oops, sorry, let's go back. Are there previous studies that illustrate the existence of poorly understood aspects of your research topic, okay? So, and if so, have you summarized the gap or the gaps in these studies? Okay, now here's an example of what she's doing. So going to the second sentence of her paragraph. So remember, she just introduced, there's something about, most studies seem to have been done in wealthy nations. As such, higher education issues in countries like the US and UK largely inform the theories used to compare and analyze universities across the world. As noted by Goldson and Fatah, many scholars apply ideas of neoliberal education as if it has no geographical or historical specificities. Okay, now what she's doing here, she's saying there's something missing. Okay, it's a gap. When scholars apply ideas of neoliberal education, they're talking about it as though the place where it's happening and the time when it's happening doesn't count for anything. In other words, it's like it's always been the same. It's always the same regardless of where it happens in the world or when it has happened in the world. So that's basically what she's saying here. But she's pointing out a problem, and she's saying there's other people who believe this as well. For example, Goldson and Fatah. Okay. Now, for the knowledge-based problem, you need to, for reasons I was just mentioning, have you identified one or more aspects of the topic that are poorly understood by your research community? Because, and this is the reason, this is important right here. I think maybe many of you shy away from stating a knowledge-based problem because it's almost like you're saying, previous researchers, you know, these guys weren't on top. They weren't on top of their game. They didn't. There are things they didn't see. They should have seen them, but they didn't see them. I mean, what's wrong with these guys? I mean, what's going on? And we don't like doing that. I mean, most of us don't like doing that. But there's actually really another way of posing a knowledge-based problem. In fact, there's several ways, and I'd like to show you what they are and get you to start thinking about what it means when we're talking about something that's poorly understood. Do we shame and blame or sneer and jeer at members of our research community because they haven't thought about certain things, or can we do something else? So one thing is that we simply say the community hasn't described phenomena, cases, hypotheses, theories, etc., associated with the topic. You know, we're just simply saying these things haven't. Nobody's really actually looked at these things yet. Or they have looked at phenomena or cases or hypotheses, but they have not explained relationships between aspects of the topic. In other words, between the descriptions, they haven't really looked at relationships between these things yet. So they describe certain things, but they haven't really seen how things are, how these descriptions are connected. Or we have described and explained things, and this has resulted in differing understandings of the topic. But nobody has really accounted for why is it that people are looking at the same thing, probably using very similar kinds of methods for collecting and analyzing data, and yet at the same time, they land up having very, very, very different understandings of what's going on. And we saw an example of that where some people really like the application of neoliberal principles to higher education, and other people say, wow, that's not a good idea at all. So we can see that kind of thing happening. So the knowledge-based problem is just saying, well, we haven't described certain things, we haven't explained certain things, we haven't accounted for differing understandings. So that's all you have to say. I mean, you don't have to make a judgment on people. Okay, so here's an example. Here's an example of a knowledge-based problem marking the research gap as not described. Higher education theories provide a rich description. Notice she's actually praising, she's praising previous researchers, a rich description of how universities must negotiate educational goals with neoliberal demands of the market. Yet, and here she goes, few have sought to define the diverse forms that this market can take and how its effects are felt in particular ways within different contexts. So that's what she's saying, right? She's basically saying these things haven't been described yet. And that's what she's doing. Now, of course, she's got to do some more work here. I've seen some of you make this move right here, very interestingly. But you have to admit this is very, very general. And if it's left alone, it's not just general, it's vague, and it's kind of hard to even understand what she's talking about. So she's gonna have to do more work with this, but let's see what happens. This is where the research question comes in. It's the research question that's going to essentially narrow the knowledge-based problem to a specific point, and that specific point has to be resolved before the research community can better understand the research topic. So that's what's going to happen. And when we see what she's done here, this is her question. This is her research question. It remains unclear, right? So there's a gap. It remains unclear as to how market-driven policies and structures shape higher education in a global scale, especially in the case of developing nations beyond the West. So that's her question. But quite frankly, she has not nailed it yet. Sorry for the metaphor of nailing. This question is still rather general, and she's going to have to cut it down even more. And we'll see, she does something very interesting when she gets to the research answer, okay? But for now, before we do that, I want to take a look at questions of analysis as opposed to questions of fact. Professor Gratoska made this point last night. I'm going to make it again because it's really important, because some of you guys are using questions of fact on which to base your paper, and that's not going to work. Editors and reviewers, and ultimately people who are going to be your audience, your readers, are looking for analysis. They're not looking for you to teach them new facts. They can do that for themselves, but they want the analysis of fact. So questions of fact, they begin with what, who, when, where, right? And what they do is they establish patterns of fact, and each one of these facts basically suggests new insights into topics. So I'm not saying that questions of fact and their answers are worthless. They're not. In fact, they're absolutely essential to writing a research paper. It's just that they're suggesting new insights, but all these insights into the topic are not connected in any sort of way. so they don't make sense. They're factoids. I mean, each one's a little bit interesting in itself. Something you use to surprise and amaze your friends when you pull a fact out and say, oh, wow, I didn't know that. But I mean, that's where it ends. So you need something more. You need questions of analysis. And these questions typically begin with how and why. And what they do is they basically ask for what is the connection between various patterns of facts that reduce the research gap. That's what they're doing. So, and that's what you need. So, does your paper clearly distinguish questions of analysis posed by previous research studies and the question of analysis driving your paper as standing out from other questions? And this becomes an important thing because once again, I think some of you actually have asked questions of analysis, but I can't really see how it's any different than what has been actually questions that have been asked by previous studies that you are citing. So let's look at how she does this. Okay. So I'm going to take that whole second paragraph now, and we're going to look at how the whole thing works together. Okay. Yet, despite this growing literature, existing studies tend to be situated within wealthy nations. As such, higher education issues in countries like the US and UK largely inform the theories used to compare and analyze universities across the world. As noted by Goldson and Fatah, many scholars have applied neoliberal education as if it has no geographical or historical specificities. Higher education theories provide a rich discussion. Now, here comes the first question of analysis. How universities must negotiate educational goals with neoliberal demands of the market. Yet, few have sought to define the diverse forms this market can take. Here comes the second question. And how its effects are felt in particular ways within different contexts. Yet, it remains unclear how market-driven policies and structures shape higher education on a global scale, especially in the case of developing nations beyond the West. There's our third question of analysis. Now, the big question is, which one of these questions is the question the writer is going to use to develop the rest of her paper? Well, we know because she tells us. First question, what followed it is, as noted by Gilton and Fatah, many scholars, blah, 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 higher educational theories provide a rich. It's clear that people have discussed this already, and they have answered this question. Now, she doesn't tell us what the answer is, and she doesn't have to. All she has to do is say, this question has been answered. And she says, yet few have sought to define how this, yet few have sought to define the diverse forms that this market can take. And she then indicates the question, and how its effects are felt in particular ways within different contexts. So that's what she's doing. But now what she's doing, she says, that could be her question. But what she does is she narrows it down. It remains unclear how market-driven policies and structures shape higher education on a global scale, especially in the case of developing nations. So she's not talking about all the effects. She's talking about market-driven policies and structures and the consequences of those things, right? That's what she's doing. Now, I was not very happy. I'm not very happy with that question. I mean, as a reader, I mean, it's doing its job, and it remains unclear. So I know that's her question. That's her question. The other questions are clear, okay? But this is not clear. This is what's not clear particularly. And so she makes it her own. Now, she gets into, we'll have to see how she does that. She gets into her statement of her research answer here. And again, the first question you need to ask yourself is, does the statement of the research answer provide three structural elements about a new understanding of the topic that highlights why the research topic is important and why the research gap is significant? So you can start to see what's happening here, that as we develop as we develop an introduction, we first start off by, well, it's important. Then we go on to, well, it's also significant. And by this point, it's not only important and significant, but it's also, there's also something new about this. So you could see where things are building up and building up and building up here in terms of the rhetorical functioning of the introduction. And once again, to make that happen, there's a bridge. Once again, it's optional, but I think it's a great idea for reasons we just mentioned about nonlinear reading, to switch, to signal that you're switching from the research topic to the research gap, and from the research gap to your answer. Okay, and you have a literature review. Once again, with the literature review, with the research answer, the literature review can be optional. If previous studies have indeed actually provided answers to the research question, I think you really need to be able. I notice some people try to cut this out so it makes what they're doing newer. This was my undergraduate students who used to pull this kind of stuff. I hope you guys aren't doing that. But I mean, you really need to you need to review the literature completely. You don't need to review everything there is, but you have to give a basically a representative select. You have to have a representative selection of things so people get a full picture of what's going on. Okay, so anyways, so your literature review summarizes previous studies to outline how the answers of their research questions have advanced new understandings of the research topic, okay? And then you also have a statement of the research answer that summarizes your major results into one or more points. Now, let's take a look at that for a bit. Let's take a look at the bridge to the research answer. So once again, does your research review of the answer have a bridge that indicates that you're switching from the research gap to your research answer, right? And here's what our writer has done right here. Very, very simple. To help fill this gap, I mean, how simple can you get? But it's very, very effective because it really clearly indicates there's going to be a switch, okay? This paper focuses on higher education institutions in the Philippines. Aha. Finally, what she's doing is she's taking that question and she's really narrowing it down to the Philippines, which is one of the largest labor exporting nations in the world, where close to 1 million workers now leave the country annually for jobs in more than 200 destination countries. So you can kind of see what she's doing here. This is important. We're talking about a lot of people when we're talking about it, but we are also talking about a specific place. So she's basically getting, well, here's what we know, here's what's significant, and here finally is I'm coming down to something very, very specific. I'm focusing on higher educational institutions in the Philippines. Why? Because it's this. Now, what did she find? Well, in the literature review, are there previous studies that have answered your research question? If so, you need to summarize the study's answers. Can you, and the most important thing is, can you show that your answer differs from previous answers in a way that advances a new understanding of the research topic? So that's, once again, it's very important to basically review literature so that you're differentiating yourself, your answer from other people's answers, to show that you have something, you have something that those answers haven't said. Now, when we take a look at the statement of the research answer, well, three things we can do here that we need to look at. Does the research answer summarize your research findings to identify a new understanding of the research topic? Is your research answer identified in one point? If it is this sufficient to let the readers see the answer as new? Or is your research answer identified in several points? If so, is this sufficient to let your readers see the answer is new? Or are you confusing, distracting readers with too much detail? So you've got a lot of things that you need to think about as you're selecting, as you're crafting your research answer here. And let's see what our reader has, what our writer has done here. Now, in this case, she didn't actually write this. I wrote this because I wanted to show an example of summarizing a multi-point research answer, okay? So this actually is kind of, with your permission, this is something I did for purposes of this talk. Okay, this study shows that the migrant labor commodity chain encourages a flexibility from Philippine higher education, which requires flexible school administrators who can predict labor gaps in other countries and can quickly shift resources to programs that produce the right type of workers at the right time, depending on the manpower needs of wealthier nations across the world that employ Filipino workers. So what happens is, what she's done is she summarized her major findings right here, and she's done this. Notice the verbs that she's using here: encourage, requires, produces, depends. What she's doing here is she's showing a cause. She's suggesting there's a cause-effect relationship with certain kinds of consequences, and she's putting this all together. Well, actually, it's me putting this all together. So this is one thing you can do. This is one way you can do it. But there's also another way, and this is the way she did it, which works just as well. So here's our new understanding, summarized by a single point answer. The study shows that the migrant labor commodity chain encourages flexibility from Philippine higher education institutions. So that's really the main point that's really actually the main point that she's making here. That's the main point. And she can actually stop right there if she wishes. But this is going to have an effect, whether you use a multi-point research answer or whether you use a single point research answer. This is going to have an effect on your, on basically the organizational forecast that comes at the end of your, at the end of your, oops, next one, yeah. Oh, sorry, at the end of the introduction, okay? Okay, so organizational forecasts, they're, again, optional. You see a lot of published work where they don't have an organizational forecast. So I can't say it's obligatory, but it is really, really, I recommend it highly. And again, largely because of this emergence of nonlinear reading. So the first question you need to ask yourself here is, do readers need a roadmap that outlines your line of argument in the paper's midsections and conclusions? And there are reasons for saying yes. And two of them, to be precise. And it is, well, first of all, you might say yes, because it's a convention that's followed by my research community. So if most researchers, when they write research papers, have an organizational forecast, it's probably a good idea to have one as well. Journal editors look for this kind of thing, and frankly, so do the peer reviewers. And it does help your readers out, you have to admit. Okay. The other thing is that regardless of what researchers or readers or other researchers or readers or editors or reviewers want, you want to orient your readers to ideas in the paper's midsections and conclusion, because your line of analysis, the line of analysis that you're throwing out and the arguments you're throwing out, they are somewhat complex, and it's really good to preview these things for readers, because it'll really help them to follow things later on when you're presenting the arguments in your midsections. Now, there's a reason for saying no as well. The ideas in your paper and the conclusions, they're very, very straightforward. So readers are going to be able to follow the paper's line of argument easily. And that's no reflection on the paper. I mean, sometimes there are very, very straightforward arguments that nobody's really thought about. And, it'll still be fine. So, and you may not really actually need an organizational forecast that basically shows the main claims that are being made in the arguments. You have to decide for yourself here. But let's see. Well, what's the? You have to think about something though before you actually start to construct your organizational forecast. And you have to go back and you have to think very carefully here. What is the rhetorical function of my paper's midsection arguments and concluding section? And there are only a few choices here that you can make. Again, I think maybe some of you think that the reason why we argue there's got to be like about 1 million different reasons for why we argue, and that's actually not the case at all. One of these things is you want to extend your research community's understanding of the topic, but you do not want to change the current understanding. You don't want to change it. You're going to add to it. You're going to extend it in a way that it doesn't extend. It's going to describe and explain something that hasn't been described or explained using this understanding, but you're not changing the understanding at all. And a lot of stuff that gets published does exactly this. On the other hand, maybe what you want to do is you want to modify your research community's understanding of the topic because you have discovered something that has not been described before, and you realize the current understanding blocks your community from actually adequately describing what you've got, okay, or what you found. Or maybe on the other hand, description is not the problem. Using your research community's understanding allows you to describe things fine, and they are well described, but you cannot explain the relationships between them using that understanding. So the understanding has to change. It has to be modified so that it can do the descriptive or explanatory work that a good understanding within your community would be expected to do. Okay, so you're doing that. So you're there to modify the understanding to make it. I'm sorry, I'm about to use another metaphor, to make it stronger. But we're really talking about descriptive and explanatory adequacy. Or this is rare, but I'm going to put it in here because it's a possibility. Okay. You're going to replace your research community's current understanding of the topic because all efforts to make it more descriptively adequate or explanatorily adequate, they have failed. So let's face it, it's time to scrap this understanding and replace it with a new understanding. And I've got the new understanding, here it is. Now, once again, to do that in an article is very, very rare. This is more like something you would do in a book, frankly. But I have seen examples of this. In fact, I have a couple of good examples of that, but it's rare. And I think from, at least anyways, the articles I've seen among the people in this workshop, we're not going to be dealing with this in any case. And then finally, you defend your community's understanding. Why? Because other researchers have made claims that the current understanding is descriptively inadequate or explanatorily inadequate. And when you've looked at those claims, you realize the problem is not with the research community's understanding, it's with these claims themselves. They're off in some way. They're not, that they have captured, or they have captured some kind of screwy idea that's not really going to work. And so you decide to defend your community's understanding of the topic. Excuse me just for a moment. Now, the question, the next question you need to answer though is, okay, if your readers need a roadmap, in other words, an organizational forecast of your community's arguments, how much detail should you supply? Well, the answer to that question depends on the kind of answer you gave, whether you gave a multi-point answer or whether you gave a single point answer. And let's look at an example of that. Okay, so here's an example of an organizational forecast. And we have a bridge here that says, the rest of this article is divided into three sections and a concluding section. There's our bridge. Now, okay, and so the it goes on. The first section reviews the literature on flexibility as a key attribute of the neoliberal university, and then factors which have led to Philippine colleges and universities to produce graduates as skilled labor for foreign nations. Okay, so this is actually, this paper had basically theoretical foundation to it, or background section, and so the writer came up with this one sentence main point about the section. The section had one main point, and this is what the theoretical foundation section did. Okay. Then she also had a method section. The second section describes the subjects of my study: 90 faculty members and 50 students in nursing programs and hotel and management, restaurant management programs, the interview schedules used to collect qualitative data, and the analysis of data into research findings to identify how Philippine administrators anticipate the demands of foreign employers and how they translate their anticipation into classroom practices. Now, here's what I was talking about. Now, this is the main point of the paper's argument. If you have that multi-point answer, if you remember, the multi-point answer really was looking at 5 major findings and basically linked them together in kind of a cause, effect, consequence sort of thing. And so what the writer could do, and that was what the writer could do in this case is not to try to repeat everything that was said in the answer, but you simply say, the third section argues that the emergence of the flexible university has resulted in keeping Philippine higher education in a constant state of flux that results in dubious practices which have lowered the quality of Philippine higher education. Now, that right there is really kind of throwing the gauntlet down. It basically is accusing Philippine higher education of actually engaging in practices that have lowered the quality of Philippine education. And where does she lay it? She lays it on neoliberal managerialism, right? That's what that's essentially what she's doing, and she's going to have to prove that. She's going to have to prove that that's exactly what happens. On the other hand, let's say, as she really does, and this is actually what she did right here. She gives a single point research answer. Now, if she's done that, what she has to do is she now really has to expand out the organizational forecast to show exactly what's going to get argued here. And so she does it, and this is the way she actually did it in the paper. The third section describes how university owners and administrators use the neoliberal notion of the university as a knowledge enterprise to justify a set of flexible practices, namely, and here's what this paper is going to be all about: hastily developing courses of studies that are abandoned once the demand for them wanes, hiring inexperienced faculty to teach these courses and then retrenching them once these courses cease to be in demand, and housing new courses of studies in new or existing facilities that cannot adequately support student learning. She caps it off by saying, this section argues that the emergence of the flexible university has resulted in keeping Philippine higher education in a constant state of flux that results in dubious practices which have lowered the quality of Philippine education. So you can do it either way. You can have a single point answer, and then you have a fuller description of what's going to be argued in the paper, like this, or you can have a multi-point research answer with maybe the main point that's going to be argued in the paper. So you can play it both ways. I can't say that one is better than the other. It just sort of depends on what you're going to do. I would say that if you go back, if you go back to this right here, you're really focusing on, you're looking for a fight and you're going to give it. In other words, there may be people who would really, and there are, by the way, there are going to be people who are going to really say that this is not so, and you're going to make them angry. But maybe if that's what you really want to do, if you really want to start a very pointed discussion on things, you can do it this way. On the other hand, if you want to say, okay, my ultimate argument about the flexible university as engaging in dubious practices and lowering the quality of Philippine education, okay, that's harsh, but there are some very good reasons for why this is the case, which she outlines there in those 3 points. So she's in a sense she's leading up to what she's going to say. In other words, basically saying it may be harsh, but it's also true. And so that's what the other thing doesn't do exactly. You just bang, I want to fight. This one here saying, I want to fight, but there's a good reason for this. And you're going to have to, readers, if you disagree with me, you're going to have to show me that these hastily developed courses are not abandoned, that we're not hiring inexperienced faculty who don't know what they're doing and then just get rid of them when we don't need them anymore, and that we're really housing these courses in facilities that that are militating against student learning, basically. So, again, it's hard, but she's building up she's trying to build up a case already. So you can do it either way. Okay, and finally, of course, the concluding section here. The main point of the concluding section. The concluding section suggests that more research is needed into the consequences of neoliberal higher education and flexible practices in the Philippines. And then she adds, and other countries that export their skilled labors to foreign countries. And that's basically the end of her introduction. So with that, well, we have time. I think we have actually quite a bit of time for questions and answers. So if people do have questions and answers on basically what is it you have to be looking at as you structure a statement of your research topic, a statement of your research gap, especially in terms of research questions, statement of your research answer, and finally the organizational forecast. We covered quite a bit of stuff right now, so there may be questions that you would like to ask. At this point, I will stop sharing, and we can get to the questions and answers. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Rani, once again for your presentation. I have some questions here from the participants. I tried to pick some of them because I know that we have time limitation, I guess. So we try to answer as much as possible. The first one came from Ridwan Arifin from Universitas Negeri Semarang. The question is, how can we make sure the topic or issue is very interesting for reader as well as reviewer itself?
You can't. But having said that, and this actually really goes back to when you're doing the research itself. So before you even started to collect or analyze data, you must have done a lot of reading. You have to have done a lot of reading on what previous research has said. And as you begin to read that research, you begin to realize that people have been working on what I'm calling research gaps. I mean, things that don't make sense. Basically, it's things that don't make sense about the research topic, and they start to make sense of them. And as you see them making sense, though, of this, then you realize there's still other things that don't make sense. So once you have located something that hasn't made sense about this topic, you have something that's of interest. You have something, if you can come up with a good research question, something that's significant, you have something that's, and you will come up with something that's new. And it's true, not everybody will be interested in what you in what you're saying, but you know, people, okay, as research communities, we are obligated as members of a community to support people, even if we don't agree with them, even if we're not terribly, we're not terribly interested in it, we still need to support them. And I think actually this is the exact role of the editor and the reviewer. They say, yeah, I mean, as Dr. Gratoska said, and there's actually quite a bit of research on this as well, about do editors have bias? In actual fact, the research that's been done, there's more research that needs to be done on this, but the research indicates that actually they don't. What they're looking for is somebody who has a topic and somebody who has a good argument about the topic. Once you have a topic and and people haven't worked on it, and you provide really, really good arguments for why that topic can be filled, then people, even if they don't agree with it, they're still going to say, yeah, but we should have this conversation. So I don't think you have to worry about that so much, quite frankly, to be honest. As long as you have, you've really found something that people haven't really thought about yet, but you have to do an awful lot of reading on that topic to make that happen. There's no way of getting around that. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Nani. Next questions. Sorry, wait. There are two questions from, let me see, sorry. From Anwar Masduki Azam. The first question is, could you please elaborate further on what do you mean by an aspect of our research topic that is still poorly understood by our research community? Could
Right.
we use the notion of geography, for instance, Indonesia, when compared to other nations, to be that aspect? Or is it way better to limit our aspect only on our academic concepts or theory and ignore the geography?
Right.
That's the first
Actually,
question.
yeah, I actually didn't. I actually didn't cover what I meant by aspect. You're right. When I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking in terms like you can look. For example, you may be studying the structure of something. So I'm not thinking about in terms of geography, but I'm thinking about more in terms of, I guess, what we'd call structure. In other words, you can look at the topic in terms of essentially. What am I looking at here? System and component. So sometimes you can look at your topic, and other people will have done the same. They're looking at terms of a system that's made of components, and each component does a very particular thing, and it interacts with the other components in a very particular way, so that the system as a whole is able to do something that none of the components by themselves or even in groups can do. So that's one way. That's one way you can look at that. So that's an aspect. So structure is an aspect. Another thing, another way of looking at the topic is maybe it's a process. In other words, that it's something that the system does in order to develop itself, in order to maintain itself, and quite frankly, eventually to disintegrate itself. So when we look at process, so that becomes another kind of aspect, and then the process itself can be broken into even smaller aspects, just like the system and components. It breaks it. The system is made of these components, and those become different aspects of that. You also have cause. What is it that brings the topic into being in the first place? So you have causality, and so you may have multiple causes working together to do this. So causality can be an aspect, and once again, the causality itself can be broken down into smaller aspects. Well, we go to the other side. What about consequence? So we have consequence, and once again, there can be many consequences as different systems, as different processes interact with each other. They have consequences on things, right? And so those consequences become an aspect of what you can talk about. So we have that. Then finally, because we're all social scientists, I mean, there's always the thing where human intervention. So as human intervention intervenes into the structure, into the process, into the cause, into the consequence, what's going on there? There are different ways, there are different aspects to that as well. So when we're talking about aspect, we're really talking about that's what I mean by aspects when I'm doing that. Now, of course, you can also, to go back to your question, this also can be happening in different places in different ways. And we saw an example. In fact, actually, the author mentioned she actually what she's doing is she's doing a structure and process thing. That's actually what she's working on there. She's looking at the structure of higher education in the Philippines and the process, and especially the processes by which universities are turned into flexible, flexible factories to produce workers for foreign countries. I mean, that's what she's really actually talking about. So she's dealing with the process, but you can see she's only talking about university administrators and what they're doing. So that becomes an aspect of a much larger question, really. Yeah, I mean, so it's you really do, and I know with your papers that you have to you're actually dealing with something too large. I know you have to cut your papers way down, but I think my feeling about the papers in general is most of them are very interesting. I mean, they're potentially very interesting, but I like that question because it does allow me to say, you guys need to cut things down. You need to something more specific, okay, to a more specific aspect that you can deal with. But think about it in terms of structure. Think about it in terms of process. Think about it in terms of causality. Think about it in terms of consequence, and think about it in terms of human intervention in the end. But you can't do it all. You have to choose. You have to choose one of those areas, and chances are you're going to have to choose a very small piece of that area for your paper. And I would always choose it on the basis that I have chosen the particular aspect that I chose because until we resolve the gap that involves this aspect, we cannot proceed to understand. We can't proceed to understand this this topic better. We'll always be blocked no matter what else we do. So we have to resolve this particular aspect first, and that will give you that gives you the answer. But you have to do an awful lot of reading to be able to make that happen. Okay.
Okay. Still from Anwar. I mean, you mentioned about reading, so that means they need to find literatures from internet. And he said, thanks to internet, today is much easier to find literatures. The problem is, it is often too many literatures. What is your strategy to wisely sort or select those hundreds, even thousands of literature review available? How do you know that one literature is more authoritative than other and therefore worth citing while others are not?
Well, first of all, yeah. Okay, that's a good question. Actually, if you take a look at who is actually citing these things, I mean, you can certainly find out how many citations a text has by going to citational indexes. So you can find out who is actually paying attention, how many people are actually paying attention to various pieces of research, and that would be the place where you start. So anybody who's attracting a lot of attention on your topic, then you probably want to start reading. You want to start reading their things. Also, there just may be people who are really very authoritative. They are known authorities in a particular area. You certainly want to read their stuff on your topics, certainly. As I said, The other way of cutting this down, though, is you look at the current things. I mean, the things that are being currently done. Yeah, I mean, it is true. It is true that sometimes in your field, even if you're dealing with something currently, there's a lot. But rather than trying to read things that were written 5, 10, 15 years ago, then you don't need to do that. So deal with what's current. Deal with what a lot of people are looking at as well, and that's a good place to start. And oftentimes it'll be sufficient. Also, the other thing you need to remember here is that, and most of you are doing this, you are writing your papers as though you are students. In other words, you're trying to prove that you know what's going on in your field. And you don't need to do that as a researcher. Once you're a professional researcher, everybody assumes, unless you prove otherwise, that you know what you're talking about. And so you don't have to show that you have covered everything. You don't really have to do that. What you have to do is you have to show the key research that has been done, that's being done currently. And yet this key research on your topic is not really getting at the particular gap that you're talking about. So you just really need to look at the key stuff and the current stuff. And the key stuff is that which has excited other people. Now, if you want to do something, if you want to go further, sometimes there's stuff that people are not, there are authors who nobody's paying attention to, and yet they have absolutely brilliant stuff. But that's rare. Honestly, that's rare. I mean, if they had really brilliant stuff, it would be out there. But as we know, I mean, there are journals, and Professor Gratoska made this point before. There are very, very specialized journals, and not all these journals are well known. So if you have a topic where this is the case, then in that case, I would go to the specialized journals that also everybody goes to as well, to see what's happening, maybe off the beaten track somewhat. In other words, it's not mainstream thinking in your area, but it's very, very interesting stuff going on. And of course, I mean, I think you'd probably understand where those less popular pathways are, and so you look for that as well. And if you don't know, then ask. Okay, so I think that.
Could I jump in?
Yes, sir, please.
Well, I think
Good
I think
evening.
you should maybe think. You're asking, how do I decide what to read? Remember that when you're writing, that you're putting your material out, and other people are going to be looking at it and trying to decide whether they should read what you have written. And so you need to think a little bit about what attracts you to somebody's article. When you look at a whole bunch of articles, why do you decide to read this one and not that one? And there's a lesson in that, because you want people to decide, okay, I want to read your article in that case. So what can you do to tell people this is worth reading? This is what I'm saying, and this will interest you, something of that sort.
Yeah, that's
End of intervention.
No, it's fine. No, it's good.
Okay.
Let's have a conversation. Yeah. Okay. So what else do we?
Thank you.
So, yeah. So Connie, what else do we have there? I think I have,
we still have a
2 more
lot.
minutes.
Yeah, but I think I'll give you one last question for this
Thank
session.
you.
I have less than an hour of material, so you can carry on till the end of the question. I don't think there's any problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, this is the last question for the session. It came from Nurdiana from University of Bunda Mulia, Jakarta. The question is, can a research method be a research gap? For example, all of the previous studies of my research topic employed content analysis, while my study, besides deploying content analysis, uses an additional research method called, for example, a judgment task. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, you can. I mean, you can. You basically can have a paper that's really about method, and that current methods of collecting or analyzing data are not doing the job that they should do. So you want to introduce something new, or you want to keep the current methods for collecting or analyzing data, but you want to modify them in some way in order to make them more robust. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Nerney. Since we have gotten the approval from Mr. Gratoska to proceed, I can give you two more questions.
Yay.
The first
Okay.
one came from Krishna Puji from Universitas Indonesia. The question is, if we conduct a case study research in a specific country or local government level in a country, do we need to provide justification why we choose this case in the introduction, or better describe it in the case study section in a manuscript for journal publication, she said. Yeah.
I mean, I think you can do, theoretically you can do it. You can do it either way. The only thing is that when you're doing a case study, you have to be very, very clear about something. What case studies do is that, I mean, usually the case comes out of you've been studying something else, or people in your field have been studying something else, and out of this has come this thing, this situation that hasn't been described before. Nobody's really thought about it. So you're going to actually present, and you've discovered it. You've presented this thing that's anomalous, and nobody can describe it or explain why it's there. It's just this one thing. And so you, as a result, you want to be able to explain that, and you want to be able to show how it is actually connected or disconnected, as the case may be, from other similar cases. I know like in the papers that we have, there are several people doing case studies, and I mean, the point the question makes here is asking about is, you know, what's the significance of the case, and it's not clear. It's not really very clear about what they're doing. So you need to do that. But I think the way to do that is to show that this thing has happened, and nobody has been able to describe or explain why it's happened or how it's happened. But I have found a way of doing that, and it's only one small case. It's true, but nevertheless, just because it's one small case, it needs to be explained. It needs to be explained by the current understanding that the community has, because if the community is supposed to be able to describe this and explain it, but they haven't done it, then that needs to be dealt with in some way.
Can I jump in again?
Yes.
Sure.
This question was about if the case study is in a certain country, something like that. Was that the question?
Yeah. Case study research in a specific country.
Well, I think the point you want to think about is if you're doing research about some topic that is set in, let's say, Indonesia, you would like people to know that, because that will encourage people to come and read it. So just signaling to people, okay, if you're interested in Indonesia, this article might be something that you want to pay attention to. So maybe this is a sort of a general study about anything, birth rates, early marriage, whatever. But your case study is Indonesia. So you want to let people who are interested in Indonesia know that, because your abstract, your introduction, are advertising your work. Okay. And it's simple enough. You just make sure the word Indonesia is there, and you're on your way.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gratoska and Mr. Nerney. One last question. It's from Bastian, from an Indonesian national studying at the Institute of Philosophy KU Leuven, Belgium. The question is, in your presentation, you point out a rather unsatisfying performance in writing a good research paper introduction. My attention goes particularly to the formulation of research question and the presentation of gap and literature review. Is this result caused more by lack of writing skill or rather by access to the latest articles in international journals?
All of the above. Yeah, I wouldn't. I wouldn't worry too much about about access to international journals per se. If you, I mean, if you have if you have actually discovered something that's not well understood by your research community, and I think actually there is enough. The people have enough access to make, to international journals. Maybe not all of them, but they have enough access to international journals to make a good judgment as to whether something, whether you've actually really found a research gap or not. I don't think that's going to be. I don't think that should be a big problem. I will once again defer to Dr. Gratoska on that, but I don't see that as a real big problem. But you do have to make, you do have to do due diligence and make sure that you've looked at all the research that you can look at and previously to see whether or not you have actually found something that's significant and that you can really ask a question about.
Well,
Yeah,
all I would add to that is that there was a time when people pretty much read everything in their field. And so if something came out about their research, they would be expected to know that. There's so much coming out now that it's impossible to read everything. But on the other hand, there are many more tools to find certain pieces of information. So if you use something like Google Scholar, if you just do even just a plain Google search, and then there are specialized search tools in academic libraries. So I think the answer to that mostly is that you use these tools and you have to be clever in figuring out what word am I searching for. But that should steer you to the basic literature that you need to have for whatever article you're writing.
Okay. I think that's all for the question for this session. Mr. Nani, I think we need to proceed to the next session. But we're sorry if we cannot answer all the questions now, but we will compile all the questions and we will have the facilitator to answer those and let you know the answer tomorrow.
Okay.
Well, I think there'll be time after my presentation to do a bit more Q&A. So if you have more questions, we can do it then.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you once again for Mr. Nani for your fruitful presentations about the review and revising strategies that I believe are very useful for the participants. For now, we will proceed to the next session from Mr. Gratoska, discussing about the current trends in academic publishing.
Okay, Paul, over to
you. The floor is yours. Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's see if I can manage to get the right screen up here. And it's not showing up, and that's cute. Okay, just give me a minute. Okay, there it is. This is screen 1. So now we will... Okay. Now, is everybody seeing what they should be seeing, which is the issues and trends in scholarly communication?
Not yet.
I think not yet. Yeah.
Ooh, okay.
Excuse me, do I need to stop sharing? I don't see my
screen. That might be the case, yeah.
No, you're good.
Already
Paul.
stopped. I
You're
think.
good, Paul.
I'm good.
You
Okay.
have stopped, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're good.
Okay, well, let's try this again then. Is anything turning up? Because I've shared the screen that I've put it up on. Are you
Not-
seeing?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Okay, let's try it again.
Perhaps you can also alternatively send or share the link or the PowerPoint to one of us, and we could.
Well, I've
You
sent
did
it, but then I was told we need to change the designation at the bottom, so I've changed it on the one I've got. Um,
Paul, would you like me to share? There you go.
okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's working now.
Okay, sorry about that, but I was practicing beforehand and I didn't manage to get it solved even with that. Okay, so what I'm talking about right now is scholarly communications. And the first thing up here is something about what's been happening over the past 25 years in terms of academic publishing. And it's really quite a remarkable switch, because if you go back to 1996, you'll see that the US was very dominant compared to Asia. So the number of scholarly publications, and this is material that's based on Scopus, our journals that are in Scopus. So the US was here and Asia was somewhere around half of that. If you look at 2020, the US has gone up to say 600 something thousand, but Asia is now at 1,429,000 articles. And there are two critical points in this. So the first one is here in around 2006. And so this blue line is publications from Asia. And so around 2006, the publications from Asia pull ahead of the United States, which is the green line here. In around 2015, publications from Western Europe fall behind publications from Asia. So there's a huge amount of academic publishing coming out from the what they are calling the Asiatic region. So this is pretty much everything from South Asia to Northeast Asia. And here are the specific figures. And so again, you see the change in the total number, but you can also see from this that a huge amount of the change in Asia comes from China. So China in 1996 produced just under 30,000 academic articles. And by 2020, it was 750,000. And now this is all subjects. And as you might expect, an awful lot of that is science and technology. Now, I've also added a column here showing what the situation is for Indonesia. And again, there's been a huge jump. But then proportionally, compared to the total number coming out of Asia, the Indonesian articles are still lagging behind. But there's been a huge amount of progress in the past 25 years. Now down here we have the figures for the social sciences and the arts and humanities. And the same kind of thing going on. There's been a massive jump in the number of articles for Indonesia. Okay, so in the case of the overall situation for articles, Indonesia is number 3 in Asia after China, or sorry, number 5 in Asia after China, India, Japan, and South Korea. In the case of social sciences, Indonesia is number 3. And in the case of the arts and humanities, Indonesia is number 2 after China. Okay, these tables that I just showed you are based on Scopus. And there's some conditions about Scopus that it's useful to understand. First of all, that the journals in Scopus are almost entirely English language publications. Now, if you think about the volume of publishing coming out of China that was in that table, it's significant that there are a very large number of journals published in Chinese. Those are not appearing in Scopus at all. So the total volume of research being done in China is very, very large. They're dominating the English language publishing, but behind that there is this huge reservoir of publications that are done in Chinese. Also, it's important to understand that Scopus journals are listed according to the place of publication. So the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies comes out of the history department at the National University of Singapore. So it is edited, all of the editorial work, in fact, is done in Singapore, but it's published by Cambridge University Press. And because of that, it counts as a Western European journal, not as an Asian journal. So the figures are a bit skewed because of that. Okay, let's talk about scholarly publishing. And I call this the strange business of scholarly publishing because it is a very peculiar business. Okay, let's just look at some of the key features. People who make things usually sell them for money. So if you were a shoemaker, if you're a farmer, you produce something and you sell it. If you're an academic, though, you don't. The producers of academic writing, that's scholars, and that's you, give away what they produce. Okay, then what about consumption? People who consume things usually pay for them. So if you go to a supermarket and you walk out of there with food, you have paid for it. If you go to a shop and you buy clothing or anything else, you pay for it. And then you consume it. But the consumers of academic writing, that's scholars again, and that's you, generally do not pay for what you use because you go to a university library. If you're a university faculty, you don't pay to use the library. Now, publishing is a business. I mean, one of the interesting things that you realize if you're in publishing is that it bridges two entirely different things. On the one side, it's part of the academic world, and you're dealing with ideas, you're dealing with exactly the same sorts of things that somebody who's teaching deals with. But the other leg of publishing is that it is a business. You make a product, which is a book or a journal, and then you sell that product. Now, usually when you're trying to make a product and sell it, what you're concerned about is who's going to buy it. Is there a market for this? And honestly, if a publisher really wanted to sell things, you would write about sex and drugs. But we don't do that in academic publishing. So the publishing decisions are not based on commercial prospects. They're based on the academic quality. Oftentimes, the academic quality may be very high, but the appeal in terms of people willing to pay money for it, not so high. So it's even a little bit worse than what I've just said, because these days, it's not just that authors don't receive any payment, but sometimes they have to pay in order to submit or get a manuscript published. Now, this is more true in the sciences than it is in the social sciences and humanities, But we're coming along to a situation where people are being asked to pay something. Now, when I started out, this was something that was really, really frowned on. If you had to pay to get published, then you just had no career, you had no future because you weren't good enough to get a journal or a book publisher to handle your work. But because of the financial situation now, a lot of journals, a lot of publishers are beginning to say, okay, if you want to be published, we will evaluate your manuscript, we'll check the quality, but we also expect you to come up with some money. Editors working on journals are usually unpaid. Some of the major journals have a paid position, but most of the journals that are coming out are handled by people who are doing it because they want to contribute to the profession, they want to contribute to their discipline, but they don't expect any payment. They don't get any payment. Likewise, when an article comes in and is sent out to get a referee's report, the referees do not receive any payment. So they're providing their time, their expertise free of charge. And on top of that, they can't get any credit for it because the refereeing is done anonymously. So people are really just doing this out of goodwill and because they want to support other scholars. So does anybody make any money from academic publishing? And the answer to that is, oh yes. The commercial academic publishers do. So for example, one of the largest publishers of academic journals is Elsevier. They handle around 2,500 journals, and they make a lot of money. Their revenues, this is a couple of years ago, but their revenues exceeded $3 billion US dollars. But not just that, their profit margin was extremely high. It was around 35%. So somehow there's money to be made from this. And you might well say, as some people do, well, of course, they're getting everything given to them for free and then they're selling it. That's a pretty good business model. Now, universities are paying for all this because they are subscribing to journals for their libraries, and they're objecting to the high journal prices. And they're saying, well, look, the articles in these journals are written by scholars who are employed by a university. So the publisher is not paying for it, the university is paying for it. They're paying the salaries of these people. And they're probably the authors are getting research grants, but there's a pretty good chance that the reason they're getting the grant is that they're working at a particular university. Sometimes it's through the university. And not only that, the people who are serving as journal editors and referees and are not being paid for it are staff members of the university. So is it reasonable then that the university is basically supporting this whole thing? And then the publishers turn around and they're charging very high prices. And so the universities are buying back research that came out of the universities. And you would have to say they probably have a case. So let's look at how publishing works. And fundamentally these days, there are three competing publishing models. One is the university press model. The second one is commercial academic presses. And the third one is open access. So the university presses, this whole thing, I mean, you always find people talking about, oh, university presses go back hundreds of years, and they'll point to Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press. They miss one that's just as old, and that is at the University of Santo Tomas in the Philippines. But the point about all of this is what those university presses were doing fundamentally was publishing religious literature. They were not published, they weren't research universities, and the kind of publishing that was going on is not the same as modern publishing. So the whole system of what the universities were doing changed starting around the 1870s. And it started at Johns Hopkins University in the US, which declared that it was a research university. And then several universities followed. The University of Chicago was created around 1891, and it was created with 3 divisions. One of those divisions was the University Press. So Johns Hopkins, Chicago, and all the other institutions that became research universities had the basic idea that research didn't have any commercial value. And if you wanted to get it published, they probably would have to do it themselves. And because it didn't have any value, they wouldn't be able to make any money off of it. So university presses were created as not-for-profit operations. Now, in the early days, most university presses really had printing presses. And so in addition to printing books, what the university press would do would be to print all the forms and the catalogs and all the paper that needed to be used by the university. So the university press would make some money, sometimes say by charging the university for this service. That's all disappeared. And I'll talk about why it disappeared in a little bit. The university presses mainly published monographs. Now, in the 1960s, a university press would probably print around 2,000 copies of a book. And about 1,000 of those copies would go to university libraries. And what they earned off of that would probably be enough to cover the cost of the book, cost of producing the book. These days, most university press books, you'd be doing very well if you sold 500 of them. And so the whole situation has changed, because if you're doing 500 books, it's very hard to cover the costs. And in fact, most university presses are losing money on every research monograph that they publish. They're making it up in different ways, but it's not a business that is able to support itself without some kind of outside intervention. Sometimes a university will chip in some money. Sometimes a publisher handles journals, and journals do make some money. Sometimes they have just enough money that people donate that will help support it. Now, the university presses publish books at reasonable prices for individuals to buy them, and they still try to do that. So with a university press book, you might pay something like 30 or 35 US dollars. And the strategy they had was that they would publish a hardcover library edition. And the idea there was, well, a book that goes into the library will be handled by a lot of people, so it needs to be sturdy. And then if the book was sufficiently popular, the university press would then publish a paperback edition, and individual scholars would buy that. So ideally, the sales of the hardcover edition, and probably that would come out first, and then maybe 6 months or a year later, the paperback would follow. But the idea was that this, plus whatever external support they could get, would cover the expenses. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, things changed. And they changed because there were some commercial presses in Europe that started buying up major scientific journals. And they also bought up a lot of smaller publishers. Now, if you look at the books that are published in the 1950s, a lot of countries in Europe had many, many small publishers. They were high quality presses, but each year they would produce a fairly small number of good books. And they also had a lot of bookstores. They had a lot of people buying these books. This was getting harder and harder as the century progressed. And a lot of these small publishers were family operations. And so the family, the person that set it up was aging. And so these commercial presses would make an offer and they would buy them up. And then they would purchase these journals, and they started pushing the prices up. They set up long-term contracts with libraries to take everything that the press put out. And the idea was that this would cover the costs. So by now, these commercial publishers, if they're publishing a book, they're probably going to print something like 200, maybe 300 copies. And the price of this will be something on the order of 150 to 200 US dollars per copy. Now, this is really expensive for an academic. And yet, to be honest about this, if you calculate the cost of publishing a book, that is actually quite a reasonable price in terms of a publisher covering the cost of everything that goes into the printing of a book, the marketing of a book, the storage of the book, and so on. And then they also push the price of the journals up. So when I was starting out, I subscribed to a number of journals, and they weren't very expensive. I might pay $10 or $15 a year and get a couple of copies of a journal. Those same journals, if I look them up today, a lot of them are costing $1,500 or $1,800. And the publishers of these journals are not trying to sell them to individuals. Some of these publications are not even offered to individuals. They're selling to university libraries. Now, who owns these publishers? Well, there's been this huge consolidation. So there are really about 4 publishers that dominate the journal publishing, the academic journal publishing. There's Elsevier, there's Springer Nature, there's Taylor and Francis, which handles Routledge, and there's Wiley. And there's a couple of others. There's a chemistry publisher that's very big, and then a few others. But the number is very small. And these are usually owned by larger companies that do other things, and particularly data analytics or just simply finance capital. So Elsevier, for example, is owned by a parent company that used to be called Reed Elsevier and has renamed itself RELX. And I've put some of the others. So there's Holtzbrink and BC Partners, which is finance capital. Taylor and Francis is part of the Informa Group, and so on. So this is really big business and very big money involved. Now, in the 1990s, something major happened in publishing, and that was a product of the growth of the computer. By the 1990s, the production of books and journals was computerized. Now, it used to be that authors sent in a typescript or going far enough back, a handwritten manuscript. And then somebody running a linotype machine would retype it. That all stopped when authors started producing their manuscripts on computers, and when it became possible to take a Microsoft Word document and convert that into something that could be published. So these days, authors do their own typesetting. The layout and the printing are all computer-based. And then the product of that can be a physical book, but it can also be an e-book or an e-journal. And if it's an e-book, then it can be distributed electronically. So this is a huge change. It affects, obviously, the costing of everything. But one of and the libraries increasingly have started saying they want digital publications. The reason is that if they buy a book, let's say they buy a book for $50, the cost of processing that book and getting it into the library is substantial. And on top of that, once it's in the library, they have to keep track of it. They have to make sure it hasn't disappeared from the shelf. And that requires manpower, and it's really difficult to do. Whereas if they get a digital publication, the metadata, that is to say, all the details about who wrote the book, who published the book, and the International Standard Book Number, what have you, all of this is going to be provided along with the digital publication. Now, to do digital publishing, you need to have a publishing platform. And a publishing platform, I haven't checked it for a while, but it used to cost something on the order of 150,000 US dollars. But on top of that, if you had the publishing platform, you had to maintain it. If you had to populate it with something you were going to sell, you had to advertise what you had. So it was kind of a big operation. And most university presses were not able to do this. Some of the big ones did. Chicago did, California did, Columbia, I think Harvard, Yale, but a lot of the smaller university presses, and in the US there are about 100 of them, simply could not afford to set up a digital publishing platform. The big commercial publishers, though, could. So what this amounted to was that it created the dominance of the commercial academic presses. Now, prices kept going up, and the libraries were not just unhappy, but they were coming increasingly to say, we cannot continue this way. We just don't have the budget to pay the increase in prices, because every year the journal prices would go up something like 10%. So they were saying, no, we can't continue this. So around 1999, there was the start of an open access movement. And the goal of this is that scholarly research should be free to everybody. It should be put up online, and anybody can go and find it and read it without paying anything. Now, still this requires the online platform. But the issue is, how do you cover costs? And the solution to this was that publishers began charging what is called an article processing charge, or an APC. So what happened previously was that a publisher would produce a book, they would put it out in the market, and people would buy the book, and that's how the publisher got their money. So the consumer, and that was basically libraries, covered the cost of publishing. What open access does is to reverse this. The author has to pay something, and the reader doesn't pay anything. So what does an article processing charge cost? Well, I've seen places that charge $500 per article, and I've seen publishers that charge up to $5,000 per article. And as I mentioned yesterday, Cambridge University Press will say to you, yes, if you're in one of our journals and you want your article to be open access, we can do that. You have to pay us about $2,800 US. Now, to me, and I suspect for all of you, $2,800 to get my article open access is not reasonable. I'm not going to pay that. Now, the open access movement is hoping that individual scholars will not have to pay, but that their universities or a government or a foundation or somebody will cover the cost. And what's happened now is that a lot of the funding agencies, particularly in Europe, and a lot of the foundations that provide funding for academic research require that the product of the research that they fund be put out as open access. So open access over the past, it's just been over 20 years that it's existed. It's gotten to the point now that something like 20 to 25% of the academic material that comes out is open access. So it's got a ways to go. But the fact that a lot of the funding agencies are requiring open access has created a big challenge to the business model of the commercial publishers. So the publishers, as you might expect, have not just said, oh, well, we're going to give up and we're not going to worry about the fact that we've been collecting billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars from selling these journals. We're just going to let everything be open access. But it created a problem for them. So what they came up with, and this is a very complicated subject, and I'm only going to say something very simple about it, but the commercial publishers have gone to some big university systems, say the University of California system, and they said, okay, what we're going to do is that we'll remove the paywall. That is, we'll let you have access to our journals within your system. In return for that, we expect your staff members will publish articles in our journals and that you will pay a fee. Well, there are a lot of variations on this, but fundamentally what the publisher is saying is we want you to continue paying us about the same amount that you've been paying for the subscription, but we will then turn our journals into open access journals, and that will satisfy the requirement of the funding agencies. So it satisfies the open access requirement, and it also salvages the business model of the commercial publishers. The problem for people in a lot of the world, including Southeast Asia, the more this happens, the more you're going to be able to go online and you're going to be able to read a lot. The problem, though, is how are you going to publish? Because I don't think there are many universities or many governments in Southeast Asia that are going to be paying these fees to the commercial publishers. Okay, let's move on. I want to say something about citation indexes. And you probably have dealt with these, you know something about them. But if you're going to have an academic career, they're definitely going to play a significant part in your life. There are two big ones. The first one started off as something called the Institute for Scientific Information. And it has been purchased a couple of times. It's now owned by something called Clarivate Analytics. And the citation indexes of Clarivate Analytics cover 21,400 journals. The Science Citation Index, they've gone back as far as 1900, and so they've brought in a lot of articles that were published before the citation indexes existed. Same thing with the social sciences. In the case of the arts and humanities, it only goes back to 1975. And then just recently, in 2005, they created something called the Emerging Sources. And what they did there was they had around 14,000 journals, and they decided they wanted to bring more in, but they didn't bring them in as full members. They brought them in this special category. Now, if you were a scholar in China, you would be expected to publish articles in English over maybe one or two every 3 years. And you would be expected to publish in one of these citation index journals that are handled by Clarivate Analytics, but not the emerging sources. So you would be expected to go into one of these established categories. So this was the initial citation index. And as I said, it grew out of the ISI, which goes back to the 1950s. Then there's Scopus. And Scopus came along a bit later, about the mid-90s. And currently they have 22,800 active titles. And they also have in their lists articles from more than 13,000 journals, which used to exist and don't any longer. It's rough keeping going with academic journals, and that's a pretty good indicator. About 24% of the articles indexed by Scopus are in the social sciences. And as of around 2015, the Times Higher Education and also Quacquarelli-Simons, which are the two major outfits that produce world university rankings. Part of those rankings depend on publications. And so they're evaluating the publications by academic staff. And so in 2015, they began using Scopus instead of the Clarivate Analytics indexes when they evaluated research. Now for Southeast Asia, Scopus is generally considered quite all right. I mean, a lot of the universities well, certainly in Malaysia, they'll say, well, we would like it if you got into one of the Clarivate Analytics indexes, but Scopus is fine. Singapore is the exception. They really don't care much about Scopus. And as I said, China doesn't care about Scopus. So there are different judgments about the value of the Scopus versus the ISI. So what does the citation index do? Well, the first thing it does is to record when an article is cited in another journal. And they calculate on that basis a journal impact factor. And the basic one that you see listed all over the place is based on citations of articles over a 2-year period. And the calculation is very simple. It's the number of citations that a journal's articles get divided by the number of articles the journal publishes. So let's say a journal published 10 articles in a year. Each one of those articles was cited once. That would mean that the impact factor for that journal would be 1. Now, there are several problems with this. And one of them is that, especially in the arts and the social sciences, it takes more than 2 years before you start getting citations. So this 2-year period is maybe all right for the sciences, because in the sciences, people want to get information right away and they will use it very quickly. For the social sciences and humanities, calculation over a 5-year period or even longer would be a better indicator of the significance of a journal or a journal article. But university administrators really want fast results. So they favor the 2-year rather than the 5-year calculation. But as I said, the impact rises over time for articles in the humanities and social sciences. Now, there's a lot of unhappiness among academics, and especially if you're not in the sciences, about impact factors and how the universities are using them. And there's reason for this. One of the critical things is journals as a whole are rated, and so certain journals will have a high impact factor. But somebody did a calculation and discovered that in journals with high impact factors, about 50% of the articles are never cited by anybody. And quite a few other articles may get 1 citation. But a few articles in these journals get a lot of citations. And so that pushes up the impact factor for these journals. Another problem is that a single article that gets a lot of citations will distort the results for a journal. So for example, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the Journal of Asian Studies published an article that was read by hundreds of people. Everybody in the field was reading it and citing it. And so suddenly their impact factor went up, and okay, that looks really good. But then the next year they didn't have that kind of article, so it went right back down. And that looks really bad. And it doesn't really tell you anything about the journal. It just tells you that, okay, they got 1 article that worked very well. So that's a problem with these things. Also, there are are ways that you can game the system. You can play around with it and boost impact factors. One of the simple things is that a bunch of scholars in a field they know each other. So they'll say, okay, if I write an article, I'll quote your work, I'll cite your work. And if you write an article, you cite my work. And that way we both boost the impact of our articles. The second thing people will do is they'll put more than one author on an article. Well, okay, some articles are written by 2 people, maybe 3 people. But some of the articles in the sciences, they'll list 15 authors, or even more than that. And what it comes down to is they're saying, okay, we got a research grant. And this research grant was given to a team, and there are 15 of us on the team. So everything that we publish, doesn't matter who wrote the piece, everyone's name goes on to it. But that doesn't really tell you much of anything useful either. And it just tells you that some people are citing articles that they didn't really use for their publication. Okay, so there are other measures of impact. One of the simple ones is an individual scholar publishes more than one article. So maybe it would make sense to figure out what the impact of that scholar is. So if I've published 20 or 30 different articles, then you can calculate how I rank compared to other scholars. And to do that, they created something called an H index. And that is what covers the impact of an individual's work over a series of publications. Another idea was that you could create weighted citations. And so you would have an evaluation, how important is a journal? How important is the article, or how important is the author? And then so you don't treat every journal article and every journal as equal. Of course, the problem there is who's going to make that decision. Now, there are other things that are, and these are actually being done. You can find calculations on this basis. You have counts of the number of times an article has been viewed online, how many times it's been downloaded, how many times it gets mentioned in social media, or how many people have bookmarked an article. So all these things give some indication of how significant or what the impact of an article is. And then there are other citation indexes. You can do a lot of calculation from Google Scholar. There's something called the Taiwan Humanities Citation Index. China has a Science and Social Science Citation Index. Korea does. There's an ASEAN index. These are not all working equally well, but there's a Thai one, there's an Indonesian Citation Index, and a Malaysian one. And so there are other efforts to calculate these things, which are not simply based on these big international citation indexes. But one way or another, as you proceed through your career, your university, your faculty is going to be interested in your research, and they're going to want to know, is anybody reading it? What impact is your research having? And so you're certainly going to have to be paying attention to the citation indexes. So that is the end. And I think we have something like 15 minutes left, so there's room for some more questions.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Mr. Gratoska, for your presentation. I think we can now proceed to the question and answer session. There are some spillover questions from the last session. I think it's for Mr. Nerney, but Mr. Gratoska, feel free to jump in if you have some more insights regarding the questions. So the first question came from Berti Alia Bahaduri from Universitas Kristen Maranatha. The question was, can I write the current phenomenon, trend, or problem as first rhetorical task? That's her question.
First, okay. Yeah, I mean, basically, basically, the topic is it is some kind of phenomenon or group of phenomena. It might be it might it might be we have the question about the about um, or is it the method as being the topic. So it can be that. It can be theories. For example, if you're looking at two or more theories and trying to figure out which one of these theories actually is more descriptively adequate, more explanatorily adequate, you can do that. So yeah, I mean, the topic can actually be almost anything, really. I mean, that's um, as long as I think as long as you can, as long as you can see it or imagine it, measure it in some sort of way, typologize it. You know look at it in terms of types. Uh, yeah, it can be almost anything.
Yeah, but speaking as a publisher, you have to get somebody to read it. It has to be interesting and useful to somebody other than you. So your problem, it's the same thing with anything you write, though. You have this critical point, who's going to read it?
Okay. Thank you again. And the next question, I think you might have answered this in your presentation, Mr. Nerni, but I would like to ask it again if you have more answer to it. So the question is, the question came from Dian from Indonesian Institute of Sciences, or LIPI. I would like to ask the example of organizational forecast that the reviewers are looking for.
Huh. Well, in a word, in a word, they're really looking for for the for the main for the main points that are going to be argued uh, that are connected to the research answer. That's basically what it is. Now, the other thing, the other thing you can do, and sometimes people do that, they'll say, well, what is the first section after the introduction going to do? What's the second section? What's the third section, fourth section until you get to the until you get to your research to your research paper's conclusion. So you can do that too. You can a lot of times people do, but the most important thing is because the paper is driven by a research question and the answer to that question, and then they're going to say, well, why is it, why is the, what is it that can be, what is it that's argued, what is it that needs to be, in other words, what is it that needs to be explained about the research question, so that they're going to want to see arguments. I mean, that's, yeah.
The best writing is writing you don't notice. And if you're reading a paper or a book and you get 10, 15 pages into it and you think, well, I don't understand what's going on, then that's in trouble. So what we're doing, and exactly what Paul Nerdy is saying there, is that you want to be explaining things to your reader. And so we're presenting this in a way where we say, okay, you look at this part of the paper and what should be there. But the person reading that paper isn't necessarily going to be thinking about that. The person reading the paper is just going to read that introduction and say, yeah, I know what you're doing here. I'm interested in this. I'm going to keep going. But having said that, as a reader, if you are conscious of this, it makes you a better reader, because if the first thing you do when you're reading an article is you say, okay, I want to know what question is being answered. I want to know what the argument is. And so you look at an article, you figure that out, and you will be a better reader because you know from the beginning where this article is going.
Okay. Thank you. And the next question came from Helta from University of Szeged, Hungary. The question is the fourth part of the course section, which is answer plus literature review. Does it mean that in the introduction part of the manuscript, we have to provide a temporary answer to the issue we raise in our study?
A temporary answer. I see.
I would say no, you don't want a temporary answer because by the time you're writing it, it shouldn't be temporary. You want to answer it. Paul, what do you think?
Yes. I mean, unless the person who's asked the question possibly talking about a hypothesis, and then you're
No.
basically testing whether you're testing whether it's right. But I mean, nevertheless, you need to, whether you're testing a hypothesis or not, you really need the answer that you found. I mean,
Yeah, when you've written the paper, when you're writing the paper, you should have tested the hypothesis and know what your conclusion is.
yeah.
And no, too many people think, oh, this research that I did, either it was interesting or so painful, but I'm going to drag my reader right through everything that I did.
Well, the agony.
Yeah, the agony, yes. And as a reader, I'm telling you, I'm not going there. I'm not going to follow you through all this stuff. I want to know what you found.
Yeah.
Okay. So the time shows that it's 9:30 already. I still have apparently 7 to 8 questions. May I proceed now, or do you want me? Do you want
It's
us
okay
to?
by me, Paul.
Go for it. Yeah.
Go, yeah, go.
Okay. The next question. It's from Nurdiana from University of Bunda Mulia, Jakarta. The first question is, can we state the research questions in research objective format? Because to my knowledge, research objectives are the answers to the research questions. That's the first question.
Well, I would say it doesn't matter. You can, if you're doing an introduction, you start off saying, I was asking this question. Okay, that tells me something interesting, but then you better give me the answer. So the introduction or the abstract shouldn't say, in this article, I explore this question, and then start dumping a lot of data out. You can say, I explore this question and my answer is this. And now we're going to get, I'm going to show you why I got that answer. That would be okay.
Okay.
Paul?
Yeah. Correct.
Okay. Okay, we're moving to the next question. This is a question consists of a lot of questions, I guess. It's from Krishna Puji, Universitas Indonesia. She first apologized for asking so many questions. She said, do you think we need to justify why we use a specific perspective in theory, for example, public administration perspective instead of humanitarian perspective or development perspective to analyze disaster response challenge? And how to avoid the literature review that's too broad without setting aside the relevant points of existing publications? And last, how do you manage imposter syndrome while doing literature review? Do you have tips to avoid concern in doing literature review, such as, what if I miss important literature? What if I can't finish reading an extensive prior research? Yeah.
Okay. What was the first point again?
The first one, do you think we need to justify why we use a specific perspective in theory? Let's say, for example, public administration perspective instead of humanitarian perspective to analyze disaster response challenge?
I don't think so. You can use any perspective you want to. I mean, that's fine. As long as it's actually relevant to answering the question you've set up. Sure. I mean,
these are tools.
Yeah.
So let's say you're pulling a nail out of something. There might be 2 or 3 different tools you could use to do it. The question is whether you get the nail out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. I mean, what was what was the second point she was making?
The second question, how to avoid the literature review that's too broad without setting aside the relevant points of existing publications.
Well, what I mean, what I said during what I said during my talk was that if you're writing an article, okay, for writing an article, what you should do is simply go for the most current, the most current literature, studies on your topic. You don't have to go way back, like 10, 15 years, and this is what everybody has said. So I mean, I would take the most recent things and just really use those, because otherwise, I mean, oftentimes people want to show that I know everything that's been read. In fact, on the topic, but I mean, actually, that's it's quite hard to do, and it's really unnecessary. You, all you really need to do is just show, here's what's being currently done. Here's what's being currently done on this, and as long as it's relevant and related, as I was talking about those 2 terms, you're fine.
Yeah.
Okay, I would make 2 points about that. One is, in an article, you probably have something like 8,000 words. And every word you use in the literature review is copying what somebody else has said. So it's not original. So you don't want to chew up a lot of words that should be devoted to what you have learned from your own research. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the literature review should not be based on publications, but it should be based on ideas. So you look at the literature and you say, okay, these are the ideas that I'm using in this paper. And it was not everything in the field, because maybe what you're doing is almost certainly what you're doing is not going to be comprehensive. So you're looking for the ideas that are significant for your piece of writing. And you put those ideas down, you put down some relevant citations, not absolutely everybody who's talked about it, and get going with putting down what you have discovered rather than putting down what other people have said.
Okay. Thank you. The next question came from Tegar
But
Satya.
there were 3 parts to that. You didn't finish the third one, did you?
Yeah, I think it's your answers kind of have answered that. But the last question is, how do you manage imposter syndrome while doing literature review? Do you have tips to avoid concern in doing literature review, such as, what if I miss important literature? What if I can finish reading an extensive prior research? Focus on the current.
I guess we sort of covered it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why. Okay, so I think we can proceed to the next question. Came from Tegar Satya, Universitas Atmajaya. The question is, my research is a quantitative research, which emphasizes heavily on the testing the relationship among variables or constructs. Can I use why and how in my research questions?
I guess that's coming to me because I was the one pushing the why and how. I don't see why not, because you have, okay, using quantitative research, and you come to some conclusion. Well, let's just say you're talking about birth rates, and so you've calculated age that people are having children, how many children per family. You've got a lot of data on this, and you do the statistics on that. But behind that, the question is, why are people marrying at a certain age? Are they marrying later? Okay, if you're finding that there's a shift of that sort, well, the obvious question is, why is that happening? Just dumping out the data, whether it's a bunch of tables and statistics or interview data or anything else, it's basically not going to be complete until you start asking, why is this happening?
Yeah, because the quantitative data is it's really all about relationships between things anyway. So as soon as we start talking about relationships, then we have to explain, why do those relationships exist? How do they exist? I mean, that's it's very, very hard to get away from the how and the why of things when you're writing a research article, because um, that's what it's really all about. That's really why you're writing the article in the first place. It's to explain those relationships between things. And of course, that's exactly what quantitative data goes after. It goes after looking at relationships between things, the differences, and trying to explain, why do we get differences? Why do we get points of convergence and points of divergence? So
Okay. Okay, thank you. The next question came from Bastian from Belgium. The question is, some journals employ the following fixed structure for organizing articles: introduction, methodology, results, and discussion. This structure is applied to almost articles from all disciplines. My question is this fixed structure necessary and ideal or desirable for communicating research findings?
it can be, yes. You basically do it as you set it out. What we do find, though, in a lot of articles these days, is that people will take the discussion, in other words, the argument, and the results section, and they'll just bring them together, so that basically you have a you have a set of claims, and then the findings become your reasons that basically support the claim, and then finally you have the evidence in your argument become individual examples of the findings. So sometimes you'll find, rather than present the findings and then you present the arguments, and once again you're in a sense presenting your findings again, or you're summarizing the findings to become reasons, and then you pick certain kinds of specific examples to illustrate what you're talking about. You can do it that way, and more, I think we're finding people kind of leaning towards that second thing, rather than having a findings section and then have a discussion section. We're finding people combining them together.
The one thing I would say there is, if an editor expects an IMRD structure,
Yeah.
you better do it, because the editor's going to be looking for that. And if you've departed too far from it and they clearly want it, then you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I guess this will go to Mr. Gratoska's presentation. It's from Akmal Jaya, Universitas Ngudi Waluyo. The question is, currently researchers in Indonesia are encouraged to publish in Scopus indexed journals. How about in America? Is it true if the quality of research is determined by the type of indexes?
No, the quality of the research is not determined by an index, but a lot of American universities are doing the same thing that universities are doing around the world, and they're relying on these indexes, not just being in the index, but they'll look at how much impact an article has, and so they want to the university administrations, they want to have this information, and they want to, and the way they get it is out of the citation indexes. But see, what happens in the US is you have research universities, and then you have places that are not research oriented. And so you can't generalize about all universities, but the research universities, yes, they're going to be concerned about the citation indexes.
Okay, Mr. Gratoska.
Does that cover what the question was asking, or?
I think so.
Okay.
I think that's covered it. Okay, and I have one question left. The question is from Elvis from Universitas Katolik Widya Mandira Kupang. The question is it acceptable to self-cite more than 2% of the references we provide in our articles?
I don't think there's any percentage per se, but I mean, self-citing is, yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't think you can't put a percentage on. If you're self-citing and what you have said in your own research before is again relevant and related to what you're talking about. If it helps you make a point, then sure, of course you can do that. Should do
Yeah,
it.
just don't expect that it's going to push up the impact of your article, because
No.
all the people who are doing the calculations are sorting out
Yeah.
self-citations from other types of citations. And if you have too much self-citation, particularly if you don't have many other citations, that's not going to look very good.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I mean,
I
fundamentally, what you're doing with any citation is telling people where the information came from. So if you've published an article before and you have a piece of information there and you're using that information again, you would be better off citing the original source rather than citing your article where you used it previously.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in fact, you probably want to really actually avoid doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, you go to the original article rather than, I cited this article, now that's where I'm getting it from. Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah. There would be a point if you've written about a topic, now you're still on the same topic, but you're saying something different. Sure, you can say, okay, I've dealt with this in another article. No harm in that. But if, like I say, if you're doing anything more, like the source of a particular piece of information shouldn't be your other article, because that article presumably refers to some previous source. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think that's all for the question and answer session. Anything to add, Mr. Gratoska or Mr. Nerny? No.
I think I've said my piece.
Okay. So, okay then, we have now come to the end of today's workshops. I would like to thank our speakers once again, Paul Nerny and Paul Gratoska, for the fruitful presentations and also question and answer sessions that I believe are very useful for every participant today, including me personally. Also for the participants, thank you again for joining us today, and especially your enthusiasm, your questions. Thank you. Before we officially close today's session, allow me to remind you for tomorrow's session. The first session for tomorrow will start just like today at 6:30 p.m. Western Indonesian time by Paul Nerny, discussing the topic salient features of publishable academic English. And the second session will start at 8:30 Western Indonesian time by Paul Gratoska, discussing the topic publishing ethics. Once again, thank you, and we hope to see you again tomorrow.